The document was already on the table. King Charles had chosen the residence, approved the transfer, and was literally seconds away from signing away permanent control of one of the monarchy's most symbolically important homes to Queen Camilla. The ink was ready. The aides had been dismissed. It was supposed to be a quiet, final act of devotion. Then William walked in, not with a whispered suggestion, not with a delayed memo, not with a soft request to reconsider. The future king placed his hand directly over the unsigned authorization, calmly, deliberately, and with a finality that turned the room freezing cold. Charles looked down at his son's fingers covering the paper, then raised his eyes. He said nothing, but the silence screamed louder than any argument. William wasn't asking his father to rethink. He was stopping him. Cold. The prince declared that no residence belonging to the crown would ever be handed over without a formal, recorded vote. And the fact that he had to say that out loud, in that moment, tells you everything about how far along this plan already was. Charles had expected questions. He had expected pushback. But he had genuinely believed that his authority as king would settle the matter. Instead, his heir had drawn a line straight across it. Camilla knew nothing until an aide found her in the corridor. She had already discussed staffing, renovations, and how the household would operate. In her mind, this was happening. Then the message came. William had blocked the transfer. The queen consort stopped walking, dismissed the aide, entered the room, and closed the door without a word. Humiliation arrived before anger did. And that detail matters, because it explains everything about how she reacted later. This wasn't a disagreement over wallpaper. This was a constitutional earthquake, and the aftershocks would hit every corner of the royal family. William carried more than just an objection into that room. He produced a constitutional briefing, a formal document explaining the legal and financial limits surrounding royal decisions. The briefing showed that permanent control couldn't be granted privately while security, maintenance, and ceremonial costs remained tied to crown funding. The transfer wouldn't just affect Charles' reign. It would bind the next sovereign, William himself, to a decision he never made, funded through an institution that was never meant to save one marriage forever. Silence was impossible after that. Princess hadn't been informed. Several family members whose approval Charles would eventually need had been kept completely in the dark. Only a narrow circle had seen the authorization, and William feared that secrecy had been essential to the plan, which is such an interesting choice of words, because it suggests the decision hadn't just been rushed. It had been protected from challenge. If the transfer was straightforward and obviously appropriate, why was it being handled so quietly? Behind the argument over walls, keys, and signatures, three people were fighting for three entirely different futures. Charles saw the residence as a final proof that his wife had been accepted, not tolerated, not accommodated, but genuinely accepted. Camilla saw it as protection against the day her husband could no longer defend her. William saw the same building as something inherited in trust, not a private gift, but a symbol that belonged to crown beyond any marriage, grievance, or personal promise. Those are three completely different understandings of what the same building represents. And none of them are entirely wrong. That's what makes this so complicated. The crisis hadn't begun with William's hand covering a document. It began years earlier during a private evening at Windsor Castle, when the late Queen summoned and after a tense family dinner. No courtiers remained. No announcement followed. Yet before the Princess Royal left, the monarch had made one instruction unmistakably clear. Residences attached to the sovereign's office were never to become rewards of personal loyalty, no matter who sat on the throne. The distinction mattered more than anyone at that dinner understood. Privately owned royal homes could be inherited, gifted, or placed into family trusts. An official residence was different. It existed to support the work of the sovereign, and its costs, staff, security, and ceremonial purpose extended beyond one reign. The Queen feared that once those boundaries were weakened, personal affection could quietly become permanent institutional obligation, and listened without interrupting. Her mother didn't speak with bitterness, nor did she attack Camilla. Instead, the monarch asked her daughter to remember one principle: generosity must never be confused with ownership. The Princess Royal understood that this wasn't casual advice. It was a warning meant for a future crisis. And that warning had been triggered only hours earlier, during dinner, when Camilla had spoken about establishing a permanent household in the Queen's official residence. Charles answered without hesitation. When the authority became his, He would make certain it happened. The late monarch heard every word. She placed her glass down, looked directly at her son, and ended the conversation before anyone could soften what had just been promised. Later that night, the Queen dictated a short memorandum, a formal written instruction preserved for official reference, and added one handwritten sentence of her own: no permanent reassignment of the residence should occur without collective consultation and recorded approval, and kept a certified copy. She never used it while her mother lived. Now, the hidden record had become impossible to ignore. With the late Queen's words in his possession, William walked toward his father's private office. There were no advisers between them. Charles stood beside the desk with the authorization still unsigned. William entered, closed the door, and placed the late Queen's memorandum beside the transfer order. What followed wasn't a constitutional lecture. It was a confrontation between a father determined to protect his wife and an heir refusing to inherit the consequences of that protection. William spoke first. He told Charles that the residence belonged to the crown, not to any one marriage or reign. It was supported through official structures, staff, security, upkeep, and ceremonial role, all tied to the monarchy itself. That made the transfer more than a private act. It would bind those who came after them. Charles didn't retreat. The king argued that sovereigns had always held authority over royal households. He insisted that Camilla's permanent use of the property would not remove it from the crown. In his mind, the arrangement would protect both the residence and his wife. He saw stability. William saw a precedent that couldn't easily be reversed. Then Camilla entered before either man could continue. She had learned that her future was being decided behind a closed door, and she would not remain outside it. She looked directly at William and asked whether he believed she had earned nothing after years of service. William chose his words carefully. Service could earn respect, protection, and dignity, he said, but it couldn't create personal ownership over an official residence. Camilla heard the distinction, yet it struck her as rejection. To her, he wasn't defending a rule. He was reminding her that acceptance still had limits. Then William turned the memorandum toward Charles. The king recognized his mother's handwriting before reaching the final sentence. He sat down slowly, visibly shaken by the knowledge that she had anticipated this exact conflict. He immediately understood who had kept it. His anger shifted toward him. He called her silence a betrayal. Still, the king refused to surrender. He left the transfer unsigned, but ordered the proposal placed before the Royal Estates Council. The signature had been stopped, but the battle was no longer private. Once a proposal entered the council chamber, procedure disguised itself as politics. Every chair was occupied. Every document was numbered. Yet beneath the formal language sat the same dangerous question. Could the king use institutional power to satisfy a personal promise? Charles believed the room would defer to him. William believed the late Queen's instruction would prevail. Camilla knew the result would define more than where she lived. Charles opened the discussion with controlled confidence. The Royal Estates Council couldn't be ignored. The king still had the right to propose the arrangement, but permanent exclusive control required approval, because the costs and consequences would continue beyond his reign. The positions formed quickly. Several senior officials supported a renewable agreement, allowing Camilla to occupy the residence while Charles remained sovereign. William rejected any wording that suggested permanent personal possession. Edward searched for a middle path, one that would protect the Queen Consort's dignity without weakening the boundary around crown property. Charles listened as loyalty began to separate from obedience. Each speaker addressed him respectfully, but respect didn't become support. Then he opened the late Queen's memorandum and began reading. The Princess Royal kept her voice firm through the formal wording. Then she reached the handwritten final line. She paused, swallowed, and continued. Honoring her mother's instruction meant causing pain to her brother, and she felt every word of it. The chamber tightened further when a financial clause was uncovered. The original transfer would have placed long-term renovation, staffing, and security costs under crown funding, even if Camilla later stopped carrying out official duties. What had been presented as a housing arrangement now looked like a permanent obligation imposed on future reigns. William finally offered a compromise. He supported Camilla's full use of the residence during Charles's reign, with complete dignity, protection, and household support. But once that reign ended, the property would return automatically to unrestricted crown use. His proposal proved that he wasn't trying to drive her out. He was trying to stop a temporary promise from becoming permanent law. The decision reached Camilla before the official statement was prepared. She would be permitted to use a residence as queen while Charles remained sovereign, but it wouldn't become her permanent royal property. No future entitlement would be guaranteed. No personal transfer would survive the reign. She could inhabit the queen's residence, but she could never possess it. Officials froze renovation plans involving lasting structural changes. Staffing appointments were reviewed. Documents describing the residence as Camilla's future private home were recalled and rewritten. Every correction removed another trace of the certainty Charles had given her. Camilla sat alone with unused keys on the table. When the king entered, she looked at him and asked only, "Did you ever have the power to promise it?" Charles couldn't answer immediately. He finally admitted that he had promised certainty because he wanted to erase years of rejection and insecurity. Camilla listened, then told him that a promise made without the power to keep it had offered comfort at first, and humiliation in the end. William soon learned that Camilla believed he had used procedure to define her publicly as temporary. That accusation unsettled him. He had protected the institution, but he now understood that victory on paper could still leave a wound powerful enough to poison the family. Then, in a recorded public message, Camilla confirmed that she accepted the council's decision and supported preserving the residence for future sovereigns. Her intervention stopped the dispute from becoming an open war between royal factions. Charles responded by asking both William and Camilla to join him at the next official engagement. The appearance wouldn't erase a wound, but it would reveal whether they could stand together after power, fear, and loyalty had been stripped of all disguise. The final resolution came when Charles entered the state reception with Camilla beside him and William one step behind. The king stopped, turned toward his son, and invited him forward. The gesture was small, but its meaning was unmistakable. William had challenged his father's decision, yet he hadn't tried to take his place. He had protected the place itself. The Royal Estates Council recorded the residence as crown property, assignable for use, but never permanently transferred through an unreviewed personal promise. Camilla's future was secured through a separate lifetime housing arrangement funded by private royal resources. The compromise gave her safety, but it also forced Charles to confront the pain behind his mistake. Personal devotion had been corrected before it became permanent royal law, and the monarchy emerged, wounded, restrained, but still standing, because one future king had the nerve to place his hand over a document and ask whether anyone had actually checked if this was allowed.